It's Mark Zickery, Mr. Sci-Fi, also Mark Zickery of Space Command, and I am here at the wonderful farmers market, which is one of the great landmarks in LA. It's been here since the 1930s, and it's wonderful. And if you ever come to Los Angeles, come to the farmers market because it's great. It's at 30th and Fairfax, but that is not what I'm here to talk about. Essentially, I wanted to talk about the fact that as a showrunner, I came up during a whole generation of showrunners who became sort of a circle of people that I knew and sometimes worked with and for. Richard Manning, Hans Beimler, Ron Moore, Vince Gilligan, Chris Carter, Michael Pillar, on and on, Brandon Braga, etc., Rockney O'Bannon. And so it's very fun because we were all sort of swimming in that same sea of television and watched it evolve and grow and become a sort of a second golden age of TV. Rod Serling and live TV having been the first golden age. But the other night I had a wonderful conversation that I wanted to share with you here, now. Bob Rich, who is a member of my roundtable and also hosts the Gilliverse podcast and website and produces that, he approached me and asked me if I'd like to have a conversation about Twilight Zone with Vince Gilligan, creator of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul and showrunner of The X-Files and so on and so forth. And I said, of course, yes, because I think he's one of the most talented men working in television. I've loved his work for many years. So the other night we had a 90-minute conversation that all of us who came up in television, we loved Rod Serling and see him as a role model and an idol and the high watermark of what television is capable of. And so it's always fun to talk about Rod and his influence on all of us. But more than that, many of these showrunners I wrote the Twilight Zone companion in my early 20s, and as my way of learning how to write and produce television, a way to learn, and it served me extremely well. But many of these showrunners were teenagers, only a few years younger than me, when they read the Twilight Zone companion and decided they wanted to become writer-producers working in television, and thus was created an amazing crop of remarkable men and women. So that's about it for me talking about all this stuff. But why don't we just go directly to the interview, and I think you'll enjoy it every bit as much as I did. So, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Mark Zickery and Mr. Vince Gilligan.
This is Michael McKeon, a.k.a. Morris Fletcher, a.k.a. Chuck McGill. You know who I am. But it's time for Inside the Gilliverse with Eric Broadbent.
You're watching Inside the Gilliverse, talking all things Breaking Bad, El Camino, and Better Call Saul. Brought to you by the Royal Baubles Collection at bobbleheads.com. For all your favorite characters from the Gilliverse, shop the Royal Baubles Collection at bobbleheads.com. Also brought to you by Rode Microphones, the official microphone supplier of Inside the Gilliverse. See their entire lineup today at Rode.com. Now please welcome your host, Eric Broadbent.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this very special Inside the Gilliverse edition. It's been almost 3 years where we're talking Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul, and El Camino, and tonight we're going to be doing something completely different, something I watched as a kid, got scared a few times, and I don't know a lot about it, but we're going to learn a lot about it tonight, the Twilight Zone. And having, since it's been a long time, I thought I'd introduce who tonight's panel is. We've got the captain of the Gilliverse ship himself. I'll be bringing him on in just a second, Mr. Vince Gilligan. And also our very special panelist guest this evening, Mr. Mark Zickery. I'm going to bring them on right now. Let's jump over to that screen right now. So we are here, gentlemen. Nice to see you. How are you doing?
Great. Hello. Great. I'm thrilled to be here with you and with Vince. I think Vince is the gold standard of television. I think he's just an astonishing, brilliant guy. And we met long ago on the when you were on the X-Files, Vince. I used to have a mustache back in the day, and when I turned 40, I had it from when I was 16 to when I was 40, and then I shaved it off, and I realized, oh, I'm better without a mustache, and you look great. You look great. So.
Thank you. This is kind of revealing a new look here. I just figured it was time because I'd had the mustache and the goatee, and I must have had a similar feeling to you, Mark, when a few weeks ago. I just said, I got to see if I still have a face underneath all that. So,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
but Mark, I read your book in the early '80s, the Twilight Zone companion, and it just and I've been a fan of the show forever. And you are the undisputed king of all Twilight Zone knowledge. So it's an honor to be talking with you and with Eric tonight.
Wow. Well, thanks a lot, Vince. I appreciate it. And I wrote the book because I came out of college. I'd sold one short story when I was 19. I was an art student, painting, sculpture, and graphic arts major from UCLA. And I'd been trying to decide whether I'd be a visual artist or a writer. And I made the decision when I sold my first short story because someone paid me $50 for it, and I realized, well, I think I want to do this. But I wanted to be a writer, producer in TV. Because Star Trek, Twilight Zone, and Outer Limits, the three original versions of those shows, made me want to be a writer. I got to meet Nichelle Nichols when I was a kid and go on the set of Star Trek when I was like 10 years old. And but there were no classes in how to write and produce TV. There was no way to learn it. And so I got out of college and I decided I would write a book about the Twilight Zone to learn how to write and produce television, as well as loving the Twilight Zone, of course.
Sure.
And so it was 2 years after Rod Serling's death. His house was exactly as he'd left it. His widow, Carol, was still living there. Even his dog was still there. So I was literally crawling through Rod Serling's attic and going through his files, and it was amazing. It was like Aladdin's cave or something. It was phenomenal.
Surreal for sure.
That's so I'm sorry, Eric. I don't mean you're the host.
You're doing a great job. You're doing a great job. Well, what we could maybe do, we'll preface this a little bit, and Vince doesn't know about this, but Mark, you know the story, the background story, how this came about to be today. So I'll say this. So my good friend Bob Rich, he runs a nice Facebook group, the Vince Gilligan fan group on Facebook. And it's all for you, Vince, and the people love you in there. But Bob's been a regular viewer of the show for a long time. So he come to me about a year ago and had this idea. He's been talking to Mark. And Mark, I'll let you take it away from there, how you and Bob got together and how we're here today.
Yeah, well, I run a roundtable for writers, directors, actors, producers that meets every Thursday at Denny's in North Hollywood at Burbank and Lankershim, and also on Zoom. And I've been running it for 30 years because even though I was very successful in television, I was alarmed at how corrosive and needlessly cruel it often could be. And I wanted to create a supportive community within the entertainment industry where people were supportive, authentic, everyone was treated with equal respect, whether they were just starting out or Oscar winners. And it grew. And so now it's thousands of people around the world, and it's just thrived, and I've been doing it for over 30 years. And Bob was a member of on my little round table because all sorts of people wash up on the shore. And then Bob mentioned that he was doing this thing, as a fan of your work, Vince. And I thought, oh, well, I knew you were a fan of the Twilight Zone. I thought this would be great to have that conversation about Rod, because Rod, it's funny because Rod was sort of the top writer of the first golden age of television, but all these people who were inspired by him and shaped themselves after, he was really the first drama showrunner in the modern sense. Prior to Rod, producers were above writers in the food chain, but then Rod was the first writer in charge in that way. And so he set the model, and all of us who've become showrunners in television, whether it's you or David Chase or Ron Moore, or on and on and on. And it's not just in drama; it's comedy too. They all have patterned themselves after Rod, and so fortunately, because I was there just 2 years what happened was I was at the Clarion Writers Workshop, which is a big science fiction writing workshop, when I was 19, and word spread through the dorms. We were at Michigan State University in the dorms, and it spread through the dorms like wildfire that Rod Serling had just died. This is 1975. And it was just shocking. He was, so central to, because I think people don't understand that back then there were only 3 networks in syndication. The people who came into your home, they were like family. You had a sense of connection to them, and more than that, actors would appear on all the shows. So John Fiedler might be on a Twilight Zone one week, and then he'd be on a Gilligan's Island the next, and then maybe Hogan's Heroes. And so 2 years later, when I graduated college, I decided to write the book. But I had one short story sale. I'd never taken a journalism class, and I heard that Rod's widow, Carol, had already turned down major journalists who wanted to write about Rod and the Zone. So I realized if I went directly to her, she'd say no, because I had no evidence to prove that I could do this. And so I'd met George Clayton Johnson, one of the great writers of Twilight Zone. He wrote Kick the Can and Nothing in the Dark, and later he wrote the first episode of Star Trek that ever aired, The Man Trap. and Logan's Run, of course. And so I interviewed him, and then he connected me up with two more people, and then they connected me up with two more people. So over a 3-month period, I interviewed 30 people who had worked on Twilight Zone, because most everyone was still alive except for Serling and Beaumont and one director, Montgomery Pittman. Everyone else was still there. So I interviewed 30 people, and then by then I knew I could pull the book off. I knew how I was going to do it, and so I went to Carol, and it was amazing to drive up this. To Pacific Palisades along Sunset, and then you turn on Monaco Drive, and then there was this, drive-in driveway, no wall around the house like there is now, and you'd walk into this really nice house, and one room was just for the awards, the 6 Emmys and the 3 Hugos and the Peabody, and there was this big living room, and Carol Serling was sitting there, and there was the Irish the red setter that was Serling's dog, and I stood there and I pitched it, and I could see the future as clearly as I see you guys. I could see how I could see. I felt absolute confidence that I could pull this off, and then Carol called some of the people that I'd already interviewed, like Buck Houghton, who was the producer of the Twilight Zone, and obviously they gave me a good report, because she then said, yes, you have access to everything, and I spent 5 years writing the book, but at the same time, the next year I broke into writing for television, so I was writing for TV while I was also writing the companion. And the book sold over 500,000 copies. I just updated it with 100 more pages and 500 new photos and links to audio and video and so forth. So, because people kept telling me stories about the Twilight Zone, and then I produced the Blu-ray. So if you want to hear me talk for 30 hours, you can get the Twilight Zone Blu-ray, and I did 52 commentaries. So,
well, Mark,
I have the Twilight Zone Blu-ray, and it's awesome.
Fantastic.
And, yes.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting, because Rod Serling, there's such a stamp of authenticity in his work. When he's talking or introducing these episodes, you feel like you'd know him. You feel like if you ran into him in a bar, if he was alive, obviously, he'd be someone to sit and talk with, and you'd love him. And it's very interesting. When I interviewed Burgess Meredith, when I was researching the book, he said, like most good writers, Rod listened more than he talked, and I thought, wow, that's very interesting. He didn't need to be the center of attention. He wasn't this big ego walking into the room. He was just joyful. He loved what he was doing.
There's a good question coming up here in a little bit. I'll have a lot of these. Actually, all of these questions we're going to have this evening are from Bob himself. So he's made it very easy on me. But I got a question for you, Mark.
I have a concern that Bob's going to break my legs with a baseball bat and keep me in bed for the rest of my life. But okay.
Yeah, kind of a misery moment, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
So this isn't a written question. This is something like I've discovered myself doing Gilliverse before. Like, I'm a fan of Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul, El Camino, everything that Vince has done. But I mean, people thought I was like this walking encyclopedia of knowledge on the subject, and I'm far from it. I'm far from it. I know there's even some characters I dare say I don't even know their names if I was to go back into like some of the smaller characters, or maybe just a cameo or something like that. So I don't know it all, and I would learn a lot from the fans. But do you ever find, as much as you know, like you're an encyclopedia on the Twilight Zone, do you meet some of these people at some of the conventions and things, and like they'll tell you a story and like, oh, I didn't know that? Do you ever get that?
Yes. Well, but and I assume you were asking me.
Yes, correct.
Yeah. The fascinating thing is people who either were students under Serling, or Doug Hayes became a very good friend of mine. He was one of the great directors on Twilight Zone. He did Eye of the Beholder and The After Hours and The Invaders and The Howling Man, on and on. Phenomenal director. And he was also a writer and producer as well. He actually directed 15 pilots, all of which went to series. So when I knew him, he was still getting checks for Rin Tin Tin. So, but after I wrote the book, Doug and I became very close friends. We'd get together often, and he said, on Eye of the Beholder, when I started directing it, we realized that we were going to run short, because back then shows had to land on exactly a certain time because it was being broadcast. And he said, we're running short, and Rod was out of town and not available, and we couldn't reach him. So I wrote a scene in that episode. I said, really? He said, yes, there's a scene in the like break room where the doctor and the nurse are talking, and they're smoking a cigarette. And the doctor says, I've seen under those bandages, it's a human face. Doug wrote that in Rod's style. And then when Rod came back, they screened the episode for Rod, and Doug was standing in the back of the screening room. And at the end of the episode, Rod just turned to Doug and said, good scene.
Wow.
And it's like,
that is a good scene. He says, I've seen it. It's a good face. It's a human face. Okay,
Yes.
it's
And so
yeah.
I said, Doug, why didn't you tell me that before I wrote the book? It's like it's such a great story. And so one of the reasons I wanted to update the book, this new edition is because people kept telling me these great stories. I mean, one kid told me that Rod would teach at Ithaca College and in upstate New York, and so everyone in the town would know him. So one time, this kid whose mom owns a shoe store walks into the shoe store, and Rod is looking in a mirror at himself, and he says to the kid, "Do you think I'm a tight ass?" And the kid says, "Well, yeah, Mr. Serling, you kind of talk through your teeth." And Rod went, okay. That was like, what a great. I mean, it's just great stuff, and but yeah. And so it's very rare that someone stumps me. Once I was at the Rod Serling Symposium in upstate New York, and someone asked me about what Twilight Zone reference was there in Leave It to Beaver, and I didn't know that one because I'd never heard of that.
Okay.
It's like just some piece of dialogue where they said, "Oh, it's like being in the Twilight Zone or something." It's like, okay, great. That's, I don't think that's gonna ruin my life not knowing that. So
There's no addendum to the book needed for that one.
not for that one,
I think
no.
you'd be safe. Mark, you
That's
said a minute ago too. You're talking about if you had the chance to talk to Rod today. I'll pose this question to both of you. This is way down the list on Bob's question, but it triggered a memory as soon as you said that. And I'll ask this question from Bob to both of you. If either of you gentlemen had the opportunity to sit with Rod Serling over lunch, what questions would you like to ask him? And Vince, I'll maybe start with you on that.
Oh man, Eric, that's a tough. And by the way, thanks to Bob for setting this whole thing up. I love the Twilight Zone. I would have loved to have met Rod Serling. I have thought about this question. There's so many answers to it, but I think I'll start with I mean, I'd want to ask about producing television, writing for television, but back in the day, back in the late '50s, early '60s, and how different it was then versus what the similarities were. But I think I'd want to know more about, off the top of my head, I'd want to know more about him, the man. And I know he was an Army paratrooper in the Pacific in World War II. I'd want to, if he'd be up for talking about him, I'd probably want to start with that. I want to hear some stories. I mean, that's, that Tom Brokaw coined the phrase, the greatest generation. I think it's one of the greatest descriptors of a group of folks I've ever heard. I got to meet Tom Brokaw one time.
That's
I told
cool.
him,
That's cool.
I love your expression, your phrase, the greatest generation. Rod Serling was part of that generation. He qualified, and he had just what I do know about Rod Serling. I'm by no means an expert, but he had terrible experiences that haunted him for the rest of his life, is my understanding.
Yeah, it's true.
And jumping out of airplanes, onto Pacific Islands and stuff like that into combat. I'd ask about that probably. Yeah.
And how about you, Mark?
Well, I'll add an addendum to what Vince just said. There's a great episode of Twilight Zone called The Purple Testament, which is about a guy who can see which of the soldiers are going to die imminently. Brilliant, and it has that sweat and that exhaustion and that it feels so tactile, that war, the way Rod wrote about it, and you can for me it's one of the greatest things ever written about war. But when I was writing the book, I came upon audio and videotapes of Rod Serling teaching a class in writing here in LA, where he would bring a 16 millimeter print of an episode, screen it, and then talk about it. And on one of the tapes, and this is material that was never released, never going to be aired. It was just Rod being absolutely candid, amazing. And he mentioned that when he was in the war in the Philippines, he was in the in the brush in the jungle, and suddenly a Japanese soldier popped up right in front of him with his rifle aimed right at Rod, and Rod thought, "This is my death. This is the moment of my death," because there was no time for Rod to react or do anything. And unbeknownst to Rod, there was another American soldier behind him, and he shot the Japanese soldier before he could kill Rod. But Rod had that absolute moment of, I'm dead, my life is over, whatever ambitions I had in my life, that's never going to happen. And so he actually faced his own mortality in a very real way. And I mean, if I could go back in time and sit with Rod Serling, the only thing I'd say to Rod is quit smoking. So, because this would have been his 100th birthday this year.
Wow.
And
1945, right, and he died at 50, right? He just turned 50.
50. Yes, of complications from open heart surgery, because with the smoking, and he had a lot of anger. It didn't strike out at others, but he had a lot of things that he was very upset about. And his dad had died at 52 of a heart attack, so there was a real sense of that. And you know, talking about the war also, when during the war, Rod's dad suddenly died unexpectedly, and Rod wanted to go back to the funeral, and the army, the paratroopers couldn't excuse him and let him go. And so Walking Distance was, which is one of the great Twilight Zone episodes, where the guy goes back to his childhood home, the town of his childhood, and gets to talk to his father. That was very much Rod wanting to say goodbye to his dad, which he'd never had a chance to do. And so
I,
Rod, you know, I mean, everything we write one way or another is autobiographical. You know, we're drawing upon everything we've read, everything we've seen, everything we felt, you know. So, you know, that's yeah. But
that, I'm so glad you brought up Walking Distance, because I'm sure at some point Eric's going to ask us what our favorite episodes are, and I would have been remiss to not bring that one up. Gig Young is so great in that, and it
incredible.
is such. I tear up every time hell, I'm just about to tear up thinking about it.
Yeah.
The end of that episode, when his father, Gig Young's father, says, who's pretty much the actors are the same age, you
Yes.
know, and you know, because he's come back from the future essentially,
Yeah.
and he says, "Is it really so bad where you're from?"
Yes.
And it just there's something, and he says, "You know what's happened," and Gig Young says, "You know the future," and Gig Young says, "Yeah, yeah, I do." And when he says that
Yeah.
the old man is dead in
Yes.
1962 or 61 or whatever it
Yeah.
was,
Yeah.
and it's just such a great. It's a
Oh,
great episode.
it's
Yeah,
gorgeous. It's like a half hour of poetry. It's so wonderfully written. And the great part is that Rod would write these incredibly brilliant scripts week after week after week. See, the thing is that when you're doing a show or I'm doing a show, you know, the characters continue, the universe continues. It's not as heavy lifting as when each episode has to be completely different. You have to establish the characters, tell the story. I mean, the fact that Rod wrote 92 out of 156 Twilight Zone episodes over 5 years, while also writing, you know, the movie of 7 Days in May and all these things, just phenomenal, amazing output. But Walking Distance is I think my favorite as well. I love Kick the Can. I love many of them, of course. Many of them are jewels, but Walking Distance is so perfect. And and that Bernard Herrmann score, just as you say, it gets you every time. I mean, it's so wonderful and wistful. And the point is, yes, you've been looking behind you. Try looking ahead. You know, it's like,
yeah, great line, great
yeah,
line, and your music. And he was a
yeah,
very, he was must have been a very sentimental man. He's so many
yeah,
Twilight Zones are about the past, and a stop at Willoughby.
yes,
Uh,
yes,
that's a past that individual had not actually lived through, but that sentimentality to a past that you had personally or that the country had,
yes,
that you didn't
yeah.
actually live. Yeah,
And you know, Rod signed up for the paratroopers right out of high school. So I mean, you're talking about like a 17, 18-year-old kid going off and you know fighting for the next 3.5 years. And so you know, it's funny. Years ago, uh, I wrote as a spec script. I wrote a script, spec Mad Men script, where Rod Serling meets you know, the main character of Mad Men, and it
that would
won.
have been good.
Oh, it
Yeah,
was fun writing Rod Serling as a character, and it was because the ad agency goes after him as a spokesman for commercials, you know, because he was doing
yeah,
that, and
yeah,
it was about how both of them in the story had reached a point. This is just after Twilight Zone gets canceled, where Rod doesn't really know what to do with himself. He doesn't know if he has a future. It's about that sense of self-definition, and that script won the Writers Guild Diversity Award, and so that was pretty cool and Serling's daughters really loved that script. So it was really neat. It was fun to write. And
who would you have wanted to cast to play Rod Serling?
for me, the person I'd love to cast as Serling would be Sam Rockwell. I
Oh,
think I think he
Yeah,
I think he'd be great. You know,
yeah,
and
I
but I'm
love
sure there's
Sam.
other yeah, there's
yeah.
others who could do it too. But you know, it's but I mean, Serling is just such a remarkable character. I mean, I've even worked up storylines. There's a feature I want to write with him as a character that's kind of a big um, fantasy thriller with him at the center of it. But but again, when I have time, so
Well, Mark, this comes up a lot on this whenever I've had Vince on the show before too, or Peter as well too. Fans would ask, or I would ask, or a combination of both, like, what's your favorite Breaking Bad episode? And that's a tough one for Vince to answer because it's like his babies, right? But we'll kind of tie two things into one here. We had the question from Bob saying, what would you like to ask him if you were having dinner with him? Imagine if you had the opportunity to ask him, what is your favorite episode and why? I would love to hear what he'd say on that.
Rod's favorite was Walking Distance. Rod's favorite was Walking.
Oh, that was, and why was that one? Because what you said.
It was the most autobiographical. It's the one where he got to say goodbye to his dad.
Okay, right.
Really, and Serling, you were talking, Vince, about Rod Serling writing from the heart, and he really wore his heart on his sleeve. I mean, he was he was that amazing mixture of intelligence, compassion, talent. It just and the funny thing is he never intended to host the Twilight Zone. That was just totally because they, the first guy they got was Westbrook von Voorhees, who did the March of Time in his big stentorian voice, really wrong for that. And then they tried to get Orson Welles, couldn't afford him. And then Rod says, "Well, how about me?" And they're like, "What? You?" And then of course he was perfect, and yeah. And the fun thing also is, it's very hard for, I think, younger people to understand the astonishing reach of television. I mean, Rod was regularly getting like 40 million people a week, 38, 40 million people. That's an incredible audience.
With no social media, like nothing to promote. It's just strictly television, cable at best,
Yeah, but I mean, but certainly with Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, you also were able to punch through because of the quality of the work and the magic. Anytime you make anything, there's a magic quality where it just comes together, and you've had that happen both on Better Call Saul and on Breaking Bad, where it's everything really comes together. Great actors, great writing, great directing, just phenomenal, and beautiful structuring of the show. I mean, I love that.
Yeah.
Thank you. But I tell you, it all, well, I mean, I was about to say TV, it didn't literally all start with Rod Serling, but he was the world's first, and what a brilliant writer, and the world's first celebrity showrunner, that's for sure.
Yes.
They probably coined the term for him.
Yeah.
And, well, the fascinating thing was, it's like the first 3 seasons, particularly, he had Buck Houghton, and Buck, when I interviewed Buck was an amazing guy, incredibly talented producer, and he viewed his job was to help midwife Rod's vision. That was it. He was never competitive with Rod. He was simply there to bring his skill set, as was George Clemens, the amazing DP. And
yes, right.
And that was why when Rod did Night Gallery, he expected they would defer to him, and then they didn't, because that was a producer on that one who was like knocking back a quart of vodka a day, and didn't give a shit about Rod Serling particularly. And so Rod got some great scripts through, like They're Tearing Down Tim Riley's Bar, but there are so many other scripts that that would have been lovely to do. I was actually proposing a new show called Rod Serling's After Twilight, where they found, Rod dictated all of his scripts and his letters and his speeches and everything. And they thought those were all lost. And then they just found 1,000 of them, 1,000 hours of Rod Serling. And so I had this idea for a show called Rod Serling's After Twilight, where he would actually narrate the show from that material, because he always spoke in that amazing style. And then I found out that the Night Gallery scripts he wrote have reverted back to the family. They own them now. There's a great Twilight Zone pilot he wrote called The Happy Place that never got made. There's scripts from the 50s that he wrote that haven't been seen since their live debut. And then we could also do scripts by the younger writers of now, and also maybe some stuff by Matheson and Beaumont and George Clayton Johnson that never got made. So I've been talking to Serling's family about that. So but it's such a fun idea.
I hope it happens. That sounds fantastic. It really, and Buck Houghton really was, as you said, must have been the unsung hero on that show, because that show, I defer to you. You know way more about the way it all got made than I do. But my inkling is that Rod Serling was very much getting the scripts, getting the scripts squared away. And I remember my grandfather back in Richmond, Virginia, who I think he more than anyone turned me on to Rod Serling and the Twilight Zone when I was just a little kid. Mm-hmm. But he said, I heard a story that anytime Rod Serling accidentally dropped his pencil, it put him 2 weeks behind.
Oh, geez.
So,
Well,
Rod is banging away on the script. So Buck is the guy as much as anyone probably who, I mean, Twilight Zone. One of the unsung wonderful things about the show is it looked so cinematic. It was
yeah,
so. It looked like no
phenomenal.
other show on TV from that era,
Yeah,
and that must have been Buck and George Clemens, as you said,
yeah.
and production folks.
Well,
Yeah,
Buck was brilliant in the fact that he also said casting directors is as important as casting the right actor. So he would
yeah,
choose the directors for the content of the material. So Eye of the Beholder, he knew was going to be a monster in terms of having to make it where you wouldn't see their faces until the end.
right.
And
Yeah,
so that was where he got Doug. He chose Doug Hayes to direct that. But Rod was very involved on the production side as well, but in a different way. The way it would work is Rod would get up in the morning. He'd lounge by the swimming pool. This is Olympic-sized swimming pool back of the house. The guest house had been converted into an office. And there was one wall. It was when I went there. There was one wall that was entirely science fiction paperbacks, all from 1960. Many of them never even opened. And on the inside front cover, there was a stamp that said "Property of CBS."
Oh, wow.
So it's obvious that Rod had said, "Send me every paperback, every science fiction book that's coming out." So, but Rod would lie by the pool, and he would dictate his scripts. Once he started making real money, initially he was using a typewriter, but by the time he'd succeeded with patterns, and maybe around the time of Requiem for Heavyweight in '57, he had enough money where he could dictate, and then the secretary would type everything up, and it freed him. But it's interesting because Matheson said, he tried it once to dictate a script and he couldn't do it. It's a very few writers can, and but Rod was
I,
able to. So he was able. That's how he was able to write so quickly because he would write. He would just lounge by the pool, dictate the entire script, playing all the roles, calling the shots, all that stuff, and then then the secretary would type it up and he'd make hand corrections. And then in terms of production, Buck Houghton was overseeing, like, he'd be in the cutting room, he'd be really timing stuff out, making sure there was enough cable on set, all that, the minutia. But Rod would be looking at the cuts and weighing in on production. And at one point, there was an actor. They did an episode called The Mighty Casey. It was a baseball story.
yeah,
I would
sure.
play the manager. He looked really ashen. He's an old time alcoholic, but the agent said he wasn't drinking anymore. And then, but Rod was saying, well, there's something wrong, clearly wrong with him. And they finished shooting on a Friday, and that Monday the guy dropped dead from a heart attack. He was suffering an incipient coronary. And so Rod went to the network and he said, "Look, we've got to reshoot this. We've got to recast and reshoot." And the network said, "Well, we agree that this isn't the fun." It was a comedy supposedly, and so the network said, "Well, we're not going to do it." So Rod took, I think, 27,000 out of his own pocket and hired Jack Warden, and they reshot all the stuff with the manager and so they took all the other footage, obviously, so he said, and so what aired at least wasn't an embarrassment, and that was Rod putting his money where his mouth was, literally, because 27,000 would be the equivalent of over 100,000 now, more probably, and
More. I've
yeah,
never heard that story.
yeah,
Because I remember that episode well, and I love
yes,
Jack. Wonderful actor.
yes.
Who was the actor who passed away right after?
What was his name? He was Paul Douglas. Paul Douglas had been in a lot of,
Oh,
yeah, he was in
yeah,
some small movies, Angels with Dirty Faces or whatever,
yeah,
yeah, but he was that kind of one of those old gruff kind of guys. Normally it
yeah.
would have been fine, but but there's actually photos of him in that episode. I've come across them over time, and just phenomenal stuff. But again, Rod was for those first three years, Rod was very involved in every decision, casting,
Okay.
everything. And of course, the interesting thing was getting other writers to write for the show who were on that wavelength, because it was a rare thing to find someone who could come up with that kind of story. There were a lot of prose writers, but then finding someone who could also write television, it was. And so initially they threw open the gates for unsolicited submissions. They got like 5,000 submissions. They read through 500 of them, and Rod said, well, there wasn't a good writer in the batch. They were mainly people who needed therapy, and so he called Ray Bradbury, Ray was going to be one of the regular writers on Twilight Zone. And in fact, when I was up in Rod Serling's attic, I came upon a box that was unopened, and I opened it. It wasn't labeled, and it was filled with scripts for Twilight Zone that were written but never made. And there were two by Ray Bradbury, and one had a little note that Ray had written on the front saying, Hi, Rod. Here's the latest of what I think what will be many great episodes to come. It was giving the feeling that he was going to be one of the main writers on the show, and he only ended up writing one episode that was produced. And
Thing the body electric. Yeah.
yes, yes, and
Yeah.
but when Rod couldn't find other writers, he called Ray and he said, "I don't know enough about science fiction. I need some recommendations." So Ray said, "Come over to my house." And they went down into the basement where Ray's office was, and he pulled four books out of the shelf. One was by him, one was by John Collier, a British writer, and they did one episode based on a story by John Collier, and the other two were by two of Bradbury's proteges, Richard Matheson and Charles Beaumont, and they became the core. And one of Ray's other proteges was George Clayton Johnson, who then came aboard later that same season, and that's what happened. But I'd heard when I wrote the book, when I was in my early 20s, I'd heard that there'd been a falling out between Ray Bradbury and Rod Serling because there was a mystery there. Why? Because there's so many Bradbury stories that would have been great Twilight Zone episodes.
Yeah.
And so I wrote to Ray Bradbury at the time, and he wrote me back saying, "I prefer not to talk about this." And neither he nor Rod ever spoke of it publicly, ever. And and so I thought, well, that's just going to be something I won't ever find out about. And then years later, Ray Bradbury called me one day because he'd come across something I'd written that he'd loved, and he said, "You must come to the house." So I came to his house and we hit it off. And then for over 10 years, once a month, I would go to Ray's house and we would just hang out and talk about life and career and art. And it was just a dream come true. And I didn't tell him I'd written the Twilight Zone Companion. I didn't mention that at all because I knew he was pissed off on that subject. Finally, we became good enough friends where I could say, "Okay, Ray, tell me what happened between you and Rod." And he told me, and there was a lot of ins and outs of that. But the final straw that broke the camel's back is when Ray wrote "I Sing the Body Electric." He said to Rod, "You must not cut a word," and Rod said, "I won't." And and so then Ray had a big party at his house for the night that episode aired because this is before VCRs. If you wanted to watch an episode, you either got a 16 millimeter film print or you watched it when it aired. And so Ray had a whole party with all of his friends at the house, and they had cut 1 minute out of it, and it was the minute that Ray had written the script for.
Oh,
It was the whole reason the story existed. And obviously it was cut for time. It was a production thing. It wasn't Rod trying to fuck over Ray Bradbury, but Ray was incensed and he said, "Well, that's it. I'm done. I'm done. I'm done. I'm done." And
That's a
you know,
shame. That's a
yeah,
shame because I've been on the other side of that. The wonderful magician Ricky Jay,
yes,
who I knew a little bit. God rest his soul. Brilliant historian of magic and magician, and I co-wrote, I think, an episode of X Files that he was in. And he said to me, he did the cups and balls routine in the teaser, and he said to me, "You can't cut a second out of this because Hatter was written by David Mamet, and you
right.
got to show it, and you got to do it uninterrupted in one shot." And I didn't shine him on. I said, "Ricky, there's no way I can promise that. This show has to deliver at 44 minutes, 26 seconds, and 12 frames, or literally two
Yes,
frame on
yes,
ad supported network TV. And there's no way I can promise that. Well, you got to show it in one. And I said, we can't promise I can't promise you any of that. It's not the way network TV is
yeah,
done. And I said, and no offense, but we have such CGI, visual effect, magic, trickery now that I could do the cups and balls routine
yes,
in a wonder,
yes,
without any training whatsoever. We could animate, make the the balls disappear, reappear. I said, everyone knows it's you. You're a genius. Everyone knows you're really doing it, even if we had to
yes.
cut it. But I don't think it was never the same after that.
No,
I'm no offense to Ray Bradbury. I got to take Rod Serling's side on that
for
because
sure, of
he
course.
wasn't even in charge of the final cut. I'm sure it was
Yes.
CBS and the sponsors. I'm sure.
Yeah.
So
Well, also, TV goes so fast, and Rod was writing at such a furious pace. Stuff can fall through the cracks. It's like you can, and because normally, of course, Rod should have called Ray and say, "Look, this is why we're cutting." Well, actually, Ted Sturgeon, the great Theodore Sturgeon, told me a wonderful story from Star Trek. Ted was one of my mentors when I was a teenager, and I took a writing course from him, and we became friends. And Octavia Butler was in that class as well as a student, and but Ted told me that he wrote 2 episodes of Star Trek, Shore Leave and Amok Time, which was about Spock getting the mating urge and all that. It's a great episode.
Great
And
episode.
so Ted, they screened the final cut for Ted before it aired, and Ted said, I never pulled rank as a writer ever, but this one time I did, because they had cut out the line that Spock says to her other suitor, where he says, "You'll find that wanting is more, desirable than having," or whatever the line was, just perfect. And he said that's why I wrote that episode, and he said you
Wow.
must put that back in, and in that case they did. And so it was a happy ending. But again, it's a different medium, and you have to, we're but
If it's a
yeah,
feature
He
length
was a
film, you
hard
have more
worker.
liberty.
yeah. Well, but the fun part is, both Vince and I mean, Rod set the mold. I mean, it's so fascinating, his journey through television, because when TV first appeared on the scene, the most serious and most ambitious writers thought that they would have a Broadway stage for the entire country. Don Gordon told me that it was astonishing. You would do a show, you'd just be in a little studio with the cameras and maybe 2 other actors, and you'd go home on the subway and everyone would have seen that episode. It was astonishing, and the power of it. And so Rod wanted to be the Arthur Miller of television. He never wanted to be a science fiction writer. He wanted to be a mainstream dramatist. But as he was more and more censored and couldn't write about race or
Right.
politics or any of those, he tried to write about Emmett Till twice and couldn't. It became meaningless because of the censorship from the sponsors and the network. And so he actually gave up $1 million deal to write features to do Twilight Zone instead. And Mike Wallace was interviewing before Twilight Zone debuted, and it's an amazing interview. You can see it on YouTube, where Mike Wallace is being such an asshole, and he's saying, "I
Yeah,
guess
yeah, he is, isn't he? Yeah,
right,"
yeah,
and he says, "I guess for the foreseeable future, you've given up on trying to write anything meaningful." And of course, Rod knows what he's up to, and he knows that he's creating a new form of television, and the high watermark of television, something astonishing. And but Rod said, "Look, if it's the first 26 episodes and out, I'll have lost a lot of money, but I'm willing to stake that on, I've got he brought his A game to Twilight Zone, and it paid off. And
yeah,
but I can't say how important it is in TV that the writers control the show. That they're the top of the creative food chain, accepting the networks and sponsors and all that nonsense. But writers being in control is really important, because then the final cut of the episode counts really as the final draft of the script, because that's the final. If you're a novelist, what you write is what the art form is. If you're a
yeah,
script writer, if you're a script
yeah,
writer, it's just the blueprint, and the end episode is what counts. And but Rod also loved actors, he loved composers, he loved DPs, he was very collaborative. It's interesting. I said when I was interviewing Doug Hayes, I said, well, was Rod very heavy-handed in how, and how he wanted you to direct stuff? He said no. He said Rod gave us a free hand. He'd give us the script and say, direct it the way you want to direct it. And with the other writers, he said, like to Matheson and Beaumont, they'd already been writing for shows like, Wanted Dead or Alive, westerns, and they'd have had the typical TV experience of being, having their work fucked up. And but Rod said to Matheson and Beaumont both, he said, write it the way you want it, and we won't fuck with it. We're not gonna. And many of those first drafts are what got shot. And Beaumont was amazed. He said, I couldn't believe it. I didn't believe it when he said that to me, but he meant it. And so if you're watching Nightmare 20,000 Feet or any of these great episodes by Matheson or by Beaumont or by George Clayton Johnson, that's their script. That's their work.
that's wonderful.
You talk about go ahead, Vince. Go ahead.
Oh no, yeah, that's okay. I was going to say Charles Beaumont had kind of came to a sad end. That was a sad story.
Yes, yes. Beaumont, for those who don't know, he was an amazing, astonishing writer. He was one of the great things I was able to come across when I was writing the Twilight Zone companion is when Ray Bradbury went to Ireland to write Moby Dick, the screenplay of Moby Dick for John Huston. He corresponded from the Royal Hibernian Hotel. He corresponded with Beaumont, teaching Beaumont how to write. It was like Beaumont would send him a short story, and then Ray would write back saying, "Here's what you need to do with it," and like he'd say, "Squeeze it down until there's not an extraneous word," things like that. And so I have this thing about this thick of letters between the two of them as Ray Bradbury is teaching Charles Beaumont how to write, and just phenomenal stuff. But Beaumont was amazing writer. And but when he was about 33, he started to seem kind of off. He started to be slurring his words, and it turned out that he was starting to suffer from presenile dementia that ultimately killed him when he was 38 years old. And so the last year and a half of the credits on Twilight Zone, he was able to get the assignment, but he couldn't write the script. And so his friends essentially ghost wrote the scripts for him. And like Living Doll, which is the Talkie Tina episode, it's credited Beaumont, but it was actually plotted by Beaumont with Jerry Soule, who was one of his friends, and Jerry Soule wrote that entire script in a day. And it's a great episode. But until I wrote the Twilight Zone companion, no one knew that because they had kept a lid on it because obviously they didn't want to, go public with that. But finally they talked to me about it. So I was glad to be able to credit people with the work they had done, and it was tragic what happened to Beaumont. Yes, I agree.
You talk about TV being different back in the day, and like today it's so different. I can remember there's so many weird things I can remember and can't remember, and a lot of things are insignificant. And I remember growing up on a farm, we had an antenna. We had a real tall antennas. We didn't have cable or anything back then. And as I told you earlier, my closest metro to me would be Windsor, Detroit, right? And so in Detroit, we had. Do you remember the days of VHF and UHF TV? Did you? I assume you had that. Yeah. Your channel 2 to maybe 12 or 13 would be VHF, and then UHF would be whatever 20, 30, 40. And I can remember 2 American channels, a WKBD 50. I think I watched my kids' cartoons on Saturday morning on that one. And
I probably wrote those.
WXON. Why I remember these things, but WXON TV 20 was the Twilight Zone. And that's how I got to discover that. And I discovered it late in the evening. My parents, I think they went away one time. One of the first times I was old enough to stay home by myself, living on the farm, and it was kind of scary. And I remember being scared by an episode. I don't even know which one it was. And then after that was done, they would switch over to pay TV. It was one of the very few things back in the day where pay TV, and you'd have to have like these scramblers. And I remember you could buy like these boxes and they could turn a little dial and squelch it and you could watch the pay TV. But yeah, it was different. But we got some other great questions coming in from Bob here. This is a really good one. This will be directed to both of you. Bob is asking, he says, how do you think the Twilight Zone gets away with being a message-based show that clearly tries to include important life lessons without ever being tiresome or off-putting in how the messages are conveyed?
Vince, you want to start with that?
Well, I think it's what Mark said a little bit ago. Rod Serling, as I understand it, he was just a superstar writer because of Patterns, which was a wonderful teleplay he wrote, and it was, as Mark was saying, one of those things like Patty Chayefsky was writing at the time, and a couple other great writers. It was things that made him the talk of the business, and he could write his own ticket. He could write his own, and he came to realize, and Mark knows all the details way better than I do, but he came to realize that he could make a lot of things, nuclear war, race relations, all kinds of things that the networks didn't want to touch. They're radioactive. He could make them palatable. He could write about them through allegory, specifically through science fiction, and it was really brilliant. And they're relatable because they're about the basic human condition, and they're so well written and well shot, well executed that you can watch them over and over again. And the twists that if new generation sees some of the Twilight Zones now and they say, I saw that coming. I was like, you wouldn't have in 1960. You wouldn't have, right? But they're still rewatchable because the acting is so good, the characters are so well defined, the writing is so wonderful. Wouldn't you agree, Mark?
Yeah. I mean, the fascinating irony, because I was doing a lot of media interviews with Rod Serling's daughters to commemorate his 100th birthday, what would have been his 100th birthday, and the fascinating irony that that most people don't realize is, if Rod had not been censored, like most writers weren't nearly as political or socially motivated as Rod was. I mean, he was a crusader in that way, and if he had just stayed in live TV or being the dramatist like Chayefsky, he'd largely be forgotten now. Twilight Zone made the stories more universal because he was writing more a story. So he wasn't saying there's only very few episodes that are kind of like that kind of give away the time. Like there's the one where they sell a car that forces the owner to tell the truth to Nikita Khrushchev. It's like, and when people watch that. When they watch that now, I'm sure they have no idea who that guy is. But the thing is, for the most part, they were universal, and that's why they still are every bit as powerful, because whether Serling was writing about banning books and all these things, riffing off Hitler and Joe McCarthy, well, now it can be Trump, and it just keeps going. Every age, it's the same issues of life, death, love, oppression. And Rod was a champion for the individual. He was strongly pro the individual, against anything that enforced conformity. And but if he hadn't been forced to the Twilight Zone as his little escape hatch, he'd probably be forgotten, like Reginald Rose or Tad Moselle or even Chayefsky. Most people don't know who Chayefsky is nowadays, but everyone still knows who Rod is. Rod Serling. I mean, he's and yeah. So, but the thing, I think it's interesting because there are two ways in which Twilight Zone significantly changed our world. One was via the audience and all the people who were just, their heads were just opened up by Twilight Zone, and their hearts were so moved by so many of those episodes. But then also, as you were saying, Vince, there's this whole generation of showrunners. Many of them read the Twilight Zone companion when they were teenagers. Like I read The Making of Star Trek by Gene Roddenberry and Stephen Whitfield when I was like 13. It was the first book I ever read about how TV was made, and that's what started to plant the seeds that I wanted to be a writer producer in TV. But the Twilight Zone companion, because I wrote it in my early 20s, I wasn't much older than the people I was who were reading it, the teenagers who read it, and then they decided to become showrunners, and so. But what Rod showed to us, we who are writer producers, is you this is how high you can aspire. Television can be an art form. One episode can change people's lives forever. And I think it's so fascinating, particularly with Breaking Bad and Don't Call Saul, how dark those shows are, but the redemptive quality in them is so strong too. Both with Saul sacrificing everything for love, to finally he comes clean, and that's his redemptive moment, of course. And then on Breaking Bad, where he gives his life up to save Jesse, that he, the fact that he's, done such terrible things, but then at the end, he's willing to sacrifice his own life. And again, that's out of love, so yeah. So
you're very kind. I don't know that I would be, I don't know how I would be the writer that I am, or the people I work with day in and day out, that they wouldn't be the writers, the storytellers they are without Rod Serling's influence and without the
yeah.
Twilight Zone. It was a free, very, very palatable, very enjoyable film school for generations of people now, me
Yes.
included.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, good answers from both of you, for sure.
But one thing I wanted to add, just in off of that note, many people who write for television don't aim for the fences every time. They don't bring their A game every time. There's a lot of people who are kind of like just kind of mediocre, they're just kind of sliding it by, imitating other shows. And what Rod said is, be original, write from your heart. You don't have to just repeat what others have done and make it a more and more
A cookie
faded
cutter template.
Right, exactly. And so what makes this such a wonderful career for all of us who follow Rod's example is that we can look back at a body of work that spoke from our heart, that was really entertaining, it made the world a better place. One episode of one TV show can change someone's life for the better forever,
We know that for sure.
Yeah, and it's so important. And so and as you said, Vince, earlier, TV comes into people's homes. They don't have to go out. They don't have to go to a movie theater. They don't have to go to a play. They don't have to buy a book. A book is a very passive creature. You have to open it and read it. TV, you just turn it on, and there it is. And again, that's why I chose television. Television is a writer's medium, whereas movies are a director's medium primarily, and a producer's medium. So but no, I love the power of television.
Mark, you set up a perfect segue here. A question coming up from Bob. Before I address this question, if you think of other shows, I like, we all like Star Wars movies, and because we have the technology today, we've like every movie that we see today is using CGI and different forms of de-aging and all kinds. Just because we have the technology available to us doesn't mean we have to necessarily use it. Right?
No.
I saw a good post about Star Wars, the land speeder. Everyone wondered how they did the land speeder. Did they put like Vaseline on the lands or whatever? But all they did was use mirrors. And so so you don't see the wheels on the land speeder, right? Luke's going through the sand dunes and you don't see the wheels. So Yeah, you didn't know that?
Cool.
Yeah, I just learned that recently too. But yeah, and if you think about it, it's very cool. So that you're just seeing the reflection of the sand, and they suspended it just a long rectangular mirror right below the land speeder. But to go back, because we didn't have all that technology there, like I think some of the best cinema, back then, Bob's question kind of addresses that. He says, what are some of the groundbreaking things about the Twilight Zone that were totally new to television back then? And Mark, you're probably the best one to start with that one.
Yes. Well, again, I'm sure like Vince, I've studied in depth VFX over all the years and creature making and all that stuff. I love that stuff, and I'm utilizing it in a great extent. But Twilight Zone, because it was started in 1959 and ran through 64, they didn't have a whole bag of tricks. They might be able to do a matte shot, or something, but for instance, when there's a great episode called Little Girl Lost, where this girl falls through a hole between dimensions and her dad has to go in after her. And there's scenes where the guy puts his hand through a wall and it
Right.
absolutely looks like his hand disappears. And then he goes through and it looks like, it's and it was done as a practical. And George Clemens told me how to do it. George Clemens had been a cameraman in the great era of silent and early talkie films. He had been a camera op man on Monsieur Verdoux with Chaplin and Blood and Sand with Valentino. When I interviewed him several times, many times. He remembered every single episode he'd worked on. It was great. But he brought out the stack of signed photos from like Douglas Fairbanks and Charlie Chaplin and on like all the great stars of the 20s and 30s, all signed personally to him. And another thing he had, which I was really impressed by, was his name was George Clemens. And I said, well, any relation to Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain? And he said, yeah, he remembered meeting him when he was about 10. And
Oh my
and
God.
and then
Wow.
and Samuel Clemens gave him a signed complete works of Mark Twain that he had. So I mean, Jesus. But this was a guy who really
But
knew
were
his.
they related? Were they
Yes,
related or they
yes,
just
distant cousins.
okay.
And but the thing was that Clemens came up in the early era of cinema and knew a lot of tricks. And he said the way they did that hand through the wall as a practical was they built the wall where there was a depression in the middle of it, so it just went back a foot at one point. And if you shot it side on, like at a slant, and just flooded with light, it through the camera, it would look like an absolute flat wall, and that's how they did that trick. And he also did another trick in Long Live Walter Jameson, and also in The Howling Man, they have a makeup change without a cut. And the way they did it was he got that from the Ruben Mamoulian Frederick March Jekyll and Hyde, which he was an
Right.
operator on, which is you do the makeup in green and you flood the set with green light, and then you switch it on a dimmer to red light, and then it appears, and
Right.
because you're shooting black and white, and so that's what they did, and it really really sold it, so
E-
phenomenal.
Even
And
old Charlie Chaplin stuff, on roller skates up in the upper balcony, and they've got like different things, different layers
yes,
in front of the camera, depth
yes,
perception.
that's
Mark,
right.
this is something you'd really appreciate. This is something right up Vince's alley, and he'll know exactly what I'm talking about in a moment. But we had the pleasure of having Marshall Adams on the show before a couple times. And I'm a big fan of practical effects, and I love it when you get to know how some of these simplistic things, like you're just talking about, are done. And he shared a story with us one time. You're looking like a nice scene in the desert in Albuquerque, and you're seeing the twinkle of the city lights. And if you just can't reduplicate those lights, what he did in a case like that, he almost made light bright. Like I know you get like when you do like a shallow depth of focus on a camera, you can get that bokeh a little bit, but to get that twinkle, he was using light brights and poking them all different colors, and on a black foam core, whatever, and then they would use heat canisters underneath that you can get at Home Depot, light those
Wow,
canisters on, and that would cause the heat waves in the distance. Like things like that just impressed me so much.
wow. Well, it's funny. Oh, go ahead, Vince. What were you going to
No,
say?
no, go ahead, Mark. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I have my own studio now I was telling Vince, with 3 sound stages, and we're shooting this big science fiction show called Space Command. We're currently shooting hours 7 and 8 of the 12-hour season. And so the first 2 hours had 1,900 visual effects shots, which is
Wow.
insane, insane. And so for the next 2 hour episode, I thought, well, let's see how much we can do in practicals. So we built an entire gigantic alien spaceship and two 8 foot tall creatures, practical creatures. And so so it's like,
Hey,
and it's every bit as much a headache as the CG was, but a different kind of headache. And but still, I love this whole bag of tricks. It's so much fun, and I've got concept artists and VFX artists working for me, and all the whole 9 yards. But it's interesting because editing, I mean, all of it goes hand in glove, from concept design to building those concepts into something that can show up on film, and then post production and all that. Everyone's working with everyone. It's fascinating. I love it.
That's neat. It's that really is a big something that the Twilight Zone gave us. Really is that, aside from the wonderful writing and the allegorical nature of the stories, and
Yes.
is the look of the show, and really, to add a little bit to what Mark was saying. Yeah, they must have had so little money
Yes.
back then, and they, so many movies now, the tempo movies, they have all the money in the world. You got
Crazy.
movies coming out this year,
Yeah.
$300 million
No.
movies. And when
Crazy.
you have a movie like that, there's no limits. There's no frame around the painting, so to
I
speak.
know.
There's no limit. And when you were doing something like the Twilight Zone, they had a lot of really interesting cinematography because of
Yeah.
George Clemens, because of Buck Houghton,
Yeah.
and
They were
also
ingenious.
because
Yeah.
they had so little money. They had to use. There's a lot of German expressionism,
Yes.
uh,
Yes.
like
Yes.
in the
Yes.
early 20s in Germany, the
Oh, yeah.
amazing sets and Dutch angles, and
Yes.
part of it because it was just cheaper to have a big black velvet backdrop and a few
Yes.
things in space, and because they didn't have the money.
It was great, and of course, because they were shooting at MGM, they had access to everything that was ever made by MGM. So pretty much everything that was used in Forbidden Planet showed up on
Yeah,
Twilight. So Robbie the
over and
Robot,
over again. Yeah.
everything. But really, really fun. But again, Rod really knew production, and that was the production can be your friend if you really understand it, because then it's like, okay, how do we do this? And Rod was his worst critic. He was very hard on himself, and so a lot of people thought that because he felt very written out after season 3, and he was saying he wasn't writing as well season 4 and 5. But even so, season 4 he did that great episode with James Whitmore, where he's like the people who are marooned on that planet and he can't let go of being their leader. It's an amazing, amazing episode. And then Praise of Pip was season 5 with Jack Klugman and Bill Mumy, and that's as good as anything he ever did. I mean, that's a spectacular episode.
That
And
was the
so
first mention of Vietnam on network TV, right?
Was it?
yes, yes,
That
yes.
episode. Yeah.
Originally, the script referred to it as Laos, and the network notes, which I read, said it is the government, the U.S. government does not admit officially that its troops are in Laos. So it would be a big diplomatic flap if you said that. Please change it to Vietnam.
Wow.
Yeah, 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 yeah. But that was like 1963. I mean, remarkable. And just incredible stuff, just wonderful. And I mean, many of us, when we just want to be reminded of how good television can be, we go back to to those shows for inspiration. I just, it always knocks me out. It was so interesting to do those audio commentaries where the way we do it, like I did one with Richard Donner and I did ones with George Clayton Johnson, but I also brought Matt Weiner in, who created Mad Men, because there were all these people who were inspired by Twilight Zone. I thought it'd be very fun to get their take, and we would watch the episode first straight through and make notes, and then we'd watch it again and do the commentary. And just these episodes, so the batting average of Twilight Zone is so high. Yes, there's a few episodes that are not great, like the one with Carol Burnett, that had a laugh track, Cavender's Coming, but week after week, so many great ones. I mean, when you realize, like, oh, one week Rod writes Walking Distance, the next week he writes The Lonely with the robot that gets its face shot out
Yeah.
and the girlfriend. That's a spectacular episode. Then the next week he might be writing Willoughby, or it's just I mean, it's like incredible. I mean, any one of those scripts would be the jewel in a writer's crown, and yet Rod had so many of them. Phenomenal,
You set up
phenomenal.
another perfect segue. And Vince, you've had the pleasure, and Peter as well, too, working with Carol Burnett as well, but
Yeah.
obviously.
Yes.
Yes, it was great, great
She
in your
went
show.
wonderful. One of my mother's favorites, too.
She is an international treasure, and that episode was. She's told me. I've asked her about it. She's told me that episode was kind of intended to be kind of if I understood it right, kind of intended to be kind of a backdoor pilot
Yes,
of the
it
whole
was.
series.
It
Yeah.
was. That's why it had the laugh track, which is very peculiar. And then on the Blu-ray set I produced, we have it with a laugh track and without. But the weird thing is, without, they stop waiting for the laugh, and so they actually say a line, and then they're just kind of like
Dead,
hanging
dead
there.
air,
You
dead
know,
air. Yeah.
it's very weird. It doesn't work. But there's great photos of Carol Burnett arm wrestling Rod Serling and winning on the set. So so that's really fun,
She
and he
said he
loved
was
her.
a great guy. She said he was great, and
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And he would often write roles for specific actors. I mean, he really, I mean, he loved actors and just was, great with them. I mean, they loved working with him. He was just, you know, because he had such incredible creative enthusiasm, you know. And the other thing he would do that was very generous, we restored the coming attraction bits on all the episodes for the Blu-ray set, and it would be Rod on camera, and he would say, "Next week we have this great episode by Richard Matheson, or this terrific story by George Clayton Johnson." He would never say, "We have a great episode next week that I wrote." He would never ring his own bell, but he would
yeah.
always credit them. And when he won the second Emmy for Twilight Zone, he held it up on camera and he said, and he named George Clayton Johnson, Richard Matheson, Charles Bowman. He said, "Come over to my house and we'll carve this up like a turkey." So
Carve it up like yeah.
yeah, what a generous spirit. Not he was just a really really great guy, really funny, really good.
I want to ask you because it's so great to get to pick your brain. I heard, and I looked it up recently. I could not find. I dreamed it, or did it, or do I have this fact correct? He would get his writers together in Westwood, which is just down the hill here
Mhm.
in Los Angeles, and there was a famous ice cream shop, a local ice cream chain in
Yes.
Westwood Village. They had one of these ice cream shops, and he and these guys would get his writers together. They'd hang out and eat ice cream, and basically that was their ad hoc writers room. Do you
Uh,
is that correct?
I haven't heard that story. It's possible, but there
Okay,
really wasn't a writers' room as such.
right,
Matt,
yeah,
all the writers were freelancers.
yeah.
Del Reisman was a story editor on the show, so he was dealing with I guess the other episodes not written by Rod, but they would get together at parties and so forth. But Rod was it was interesting. I was talking to William F. Nolan, who was part of Beaumont's Circle. He co-wrote Logan's Run with George Clayton Johnson, and Bill said, Rod would try and be one of the gang, but it was really Beaumont at the center of that, and Matheson and George Clayton Johnson and John Tomerlin and all those guys, O.C. Rich, kind of like the spokes of a wheel, and they were kind of like these intellectual kind of fanboy, whatever. They loved Hemingway. They loved all these things. They would talk about it endlessly. Loved movies. And Rod would come in and he would like tell a joke, and it'd be kind of like a Rod Serling kind of joke. It would be more earthy, more. Rod wasn't from their tradition. He wasn't the same as them, and he couldn't really be. So he was never. They all liked him. They all I mean, everybody respected everybody, but he wasn't the gang like the other ones were.
Okay.
And so it was really interesting. And also, there was a problem because, for many of these writers, they've been writing for like a penny a word or 5 cents a word, or writing a novel for $1,000, and then there's Rod Serling earning like $80,000, or hundreds of thousands of dollars a year or whatever it was. He's wealthy because he's writing for TV. I mean, but you were asking about the budget of Twilight Zone. The first year pattern budget, I think, was $83,000 per episode, and they shot them in 3 days with one day of rehearsal. Yeah,
3 days with one day of rehearsal.
yeah.
Wow.
But there's a great story about Nightmare at 20,000 Feet because they shot that in an actual airplane fuselage on the soundstage. It had no wild walls. Oh, look at that, Nick
I
Cravat.
even
Yeah,
made the little thing because it doesn't come with it.
That's
that's great.
fantastic.
I love it. I love it. But
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 I'm sorry, they shot it in a
yeah,
real.
well, they were shooting Nightmare at 20,000 Feet on a real airplane fuselage, and it was the logistics of shooting it were crazy 'cause with that airplane engine and the whole thing, Nick Cravat flying in on wires and so forth. But they had planned a 3-day shoot, and at the beginning of the second day, they came to Richard Donner and said the executives from Metro, and they said, we need to do pickup shots for a feature we're doing, so you can only have this for 2 days rather than three. And so Richard Donner said, well, then we're going to shoot all night. And so they shot that entire episode in 2 days.
Oh
And
my.
as dawn was rising, they shot that scene where they go out of the airplane with Shatner on the
Right.
stretcher, and that was on a soundstage. They just blacked all the walls out and made it look like it was outside at night. But they shot that all in 2 days with handheld cameras, basically. And it was so that's amazing. That's just holy shit.
It's a great episode. It's one that strangely I don't rewatch
Huh.
because, and the reason is, and Shatner's great in it.
Yeah.
Everybody's great. It's well directed. It's well written. It's just it makes me so uncomfortable when he's acting so crazy. And of course he's not crazy. It's
Yeah,
true.
right.
Everyone's looking at him like he's crazy. And I just find it so it raises my blood pressure. I just find it that it just like I can't watch because it's like the whole time they're like, what a lunatic this guy is.
Yes,
And,
yes,
and it just but it's so great. It's such a
yes.
great
Iconic.
and they had so little money. I mean, that is not a particularly scary looking monster
Yeah.
to be.
No,
This
Matheson.
is
Yeah, Matheson was not pleased with it. In his
yeah.
script, he describes the gremlin as being like almost like in black velvet with diamond dust on it. So you're just catching little bits of light, little something. It's much more menacing. And he said this thing looked like a teddy bear coming at you. And so
Hard to
Yeah,
be
it's
frightened.
got an afro. It's just like it's just like
yeah. The only
it,
cool part is the face was sculpted by the great William Tuttle, and William
oh,
Tuttle did a lot of the makeup. He did the makeup stuff on Twilight Zone. So Eye of the Beholder, he and Doug, the director Doug Hayes, they got into the clay, both of them, and Doug came up with the idea of the asymmetry and the pig noses, and and William Tuttle did the aging makeups in Long Live Walter Jameson, and those great masks, in
the
the
masks in
yeah.
the Ida Lupino episode,
Yeah.
right? Yeah,
Well, yeah, and the
that she directed, right?
yeah, and a year or so ago, I went to the Serling Symposium in upstate New York, and I went over to Jody Serling's house. She's one of Rod's daughters, and those masks were on the wall in a display
Ah,
Wow.
case, and I had no idea they still existed. It's
oh,
very rare you come across Twilight Zone stuff, and the props or costumes or any of that stuff. And
yeah.
so I said, "What's the story on this?" She said, "Dad brought them home and put them on the wall in the house." And Carol, his wife, said, "I can't stand looking at those." So they were sent to the garage. And finally, when Jody had her own place, she said, "Mom, can I have those?" And she does. So it's really cool that they still exist. Really, really neat. So
You can buy them, not the originals. You can
yeah,
buy them. They made recreations
I've
of
seen
them that
it.
are
Yeah.
awesome. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, amazing, amazing stuff. And but yeah, no, but there's just such great creativity. I mean, just such brilliance and
yeah,
one thing that many of the people I interviewed said was when you get a Rod Serling script, it was of such high quality that you would then rise to the level of it. So
yeah,
Bernard Herrmann, his music, or Jerry Goldsmith, his music on Twilight Zone is certainly as powerful as the features they were writing. I mean, for God's sake, Bernard Herrmann scored Citizen Kane and Taxi Driver and Psycho, but here he is on Twilight Zone and doing phenomenal stuff.
We did a
yeah.
nod to the show writers. Sorry, Vince.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead,
No, I
Eric.
was just saying we did a nod earlier to the showrunners. I mean, showrunners and the casting directors, but the scoring. Dave Porter
Yes.
in our world here in the Gilliverse. I mean,
Mm.
it's his hand in hand.
Yeah,
Yes.
the music, I agree completely. That's my favorite. The famous, and
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on the composer who did. Yeah,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
one I don't. That is the most famous. That's the one everyone
Yes.
knows. But the Bernard Herrmann
Yeah.
score of the earlier seasons, that is my favorite. That's my favorite opening too.
Yes.
There is there is a I could quote it once it starts.
There's a
There was a
signpost up ahead. Yeah.
it's a middle ground between
Yes.
light and shadow, between
Yes.
science and fiction, and it lies
Yes.
between the feet of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. I love that. I love that. That's my favorite opening. And the
Yeah,
burn.
well, it was very funny because Rod got it wrong the first time round. He said there's a sixth dimension beyond that which is known to man. And so
Right.
then the executive, Bill Self said, "Rod, I know what the first four are. What's the fifth?" So they corrected it to there's a fifth dimension, and
Right.
and I actually came across other opening narrations that Rod did that they didn't end up using, like where he was just trying to do that opening Twilight Zone monologue. And so it's fascinating just to see Rod playing with all of that stuff. And just amazing, amazing. And Rod had, back then they didn't have VCRs, so Rod had in his contract that he would get two 16 millimeter prints of every episode. And so in the garage, they were piled high like mountains of film cans. And I would take home stacks of them like this and put them on the projector because they had the original commercials and the coming attraction spots, and they were
Wow.
uncut. Or they, in syndication, they cut them down. And
Yeah.
so that was just a revelation. But it's funny because as the seasons went on, CBS got a little more slapdash. So sometimes there'd be 3 copies or 4 copies of one episode and no copies of another. Or like with the hour episodes, there might be one reel of the two reels. So I saw, the parallel. I think I saw the ending of it, but not the beginning. Things like that. But it was still very, very. I mean, Carol Serling was so great to trust me with all this stuff, and really subscribed to a clipping service after about 1956, after about Patterns. So everything that was written about him or the Twilight Zone, every article, everything, was in these big leather volumes by year. And it was like the Encyclopedia Rod Serling, and his secretary had like glued them into in chronological order. So it was just phenomenal, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
Fantastic. Did they, I can't remember now. Did they shoot on 35 or did they shoot
Yeah,
on, did they,
no,
they shot on
35.
35, they just bumped it down to 16 for
Right,
him.
right. And then when we did the Blu-ray set, it was remastered, so we went back to the original 35 millimeter prints, and
Nice.
I think we even went back to the negatives, the original negatives, and because they're
Yeah,
gorgeous. I mean, the restoration's just gorgeous on them, and
yeah,
of course, it's the most beautiful black and white TV show ever made. It's
yeah.
just astonishing, astonishing,
Right.
and yeah, yeah.
Absolutely
So
fantastic. Here's
yeah.
another question. This is really good as well, too, from Bob. He says, when certain TV shows, and either one of you can field this, when certain TV shows tried to recapture the feel and style of the Twilight Zone but didn't quite succeed, what do you think they may have missed or didn't quite appreciate about Rod's work?
I think, Mark, you should answer that one. I mean, I have some thoughts too, but I mean, I don't know, lightning in a bottle is lightning in a bottle.
Yes,
It's,
yes.
how would you answer that?
Well, yeah. I mean, first of all, most science fiction shows, great science fiction shows, have that visionary at the top, whether it's Rod or Gene Roddenberry or Chris Carter. I don't know what it was like to work with him, but certainly
It was
he
great.
had that
It was great.
vision. Or Babylon 5 with Joe Straczynski, which I also wrote for. It's like there's that guy who's got the the magic, and
Yeah.
then the stars align with the actors and with the directors, and see, the fascinating thing about TV is if anyone in a major capacity fucks up, the show is fucked. So if it's shot badly, if it's acted badly, it's like I've written for shows years ago where I was like, okay, the scripts were great, but the lead actor was an idiot, and
Yeah.
the aesthetic choices he was insisting on were like, let's take this truck and drive it off a cliff. It's like, oh, okay, well, c'est la vie, onward. But yes, it was lightning in a bottle, and I think personally, I think that the most direct ancestor of or descendant of Twilight Zone is probably Black Mirror, but it's a very dark show,
Yes.
but it's
Yes.
brilliant. It's brilliant. But Rod had a lot more compassion. Rod had I mean, he was the great part about Twilight Zone and Star Trek and Outer Limits, the original versions of those shows, was they were optimistic. They were cautionary, but they also said we can come together, we can create a future worth living, and we must not let go of that responsibility. We can make something better. And Rod was very much about that, as were Joe Stefano on Outer Limits, and Leslie Stevens, and Roddenberry, and Harlan Ellison and Dorothy Fontana, and all those wonderful Gene Kuhn, all those great writers on Star Trek. Well, I mean, the part of the thing that brought this all to me was that I started noticing that the writers on those three shows, Twilight Zone, Outer Limits, and Star Trek, were the same writers that I was reading their books, Matheson and Harlan Ellison and Beaumont and Bradbury. And so when I was a teenager, I went to conventions, science fiction conventions, and sought them out and got many of them as mentors. So it was like, science fiction has a great tradition of the established writers mentoring younger writers who then go on to mentor others. And so I was definitely a beneficiary of that.
I'm glad you brought up Black Mirror because that is the spiritual successor, if
Yes.
one that stands out above the others nowadays. But it's interesting, and I've met, and that is, and got to be in vastly large part of that is because of Charlie Brooker, who created
Yes.
it, who I
Yes.
got to meet years ago, is a brilliant writer and producer and
Yeah.
personality and everything over in the UK. And he
Yes.
really, but you're right. It's brilliant, but it is dystopic.
Yes.
And Twilight Zone was optimistic.
Yes.
It's a glass half empty versus glass half full, and maybe that says as much about the times we live in. Although there wasn't, we live in. I personally, it's scary how we live in two countries,
Yes.
now. But we didn't have that back in the late 50s, early 60s, but we lived under I wasn't around, but I mean, the world lived under the threat of nuclear annihilation.
Yes.
But
And
maybe in a weird way, it brought folks together somewhat in a way that we don't have now. I don't know.
I think each era has its own shitty things. I recently came up with a phrase which is dysutopia, because that's what the future always ends up being, a mixture of dystopia and utopia. It's never one or the other extreme, but it's always a mixture. So,
Combo.
we have like these wonderful cell phones and this wonderful conversation we're having via computer and all that. And then we've got, I won't go into a tirade about the current political situation, but Jesus Christ, it's like, but one thing I found, and this is something that Rod, I think, taught me, was when I was raising money for Space Command, and I raised over $4 million. Now I'm raising 20 for the slate of TV shows and movies we're doing. I found it was very interesting because I sold investment shares for $7,500 each, and also did crowdfunding campaigns. But my investors, I would take them to lunch and take them to Comic-Con and so forth, and find out about them. And because the whole point of Space Command was we can create a future worth living in. I wanted to do something inspiring, like the original Star Trek had inspired me when I was a kid. And because a lot of science fiction of a few years ago is very dystopic, it's like the future's going to be shit and there's nothing you can do about it. And it's like, I thought, well, that's disempowering. So I said, we can meet with compassion. We can reach out to others who are, from all walks of life. We can create a future worth living in. And so these investors all responded. And one of them, I took him to lunch, and he told me he was a truck driver, and he told me he was a Trump supporter, and that his coworkers had made him a pariah. And I said, I'm so glad you told me that, because he was investing. He wasn't a wealthy guy, but he was investing thousands of dollars in me and this show. And I said, because he's a loving father, and we can meet in the middle ground of, we want a future for our children and our grandchildren that's where they're safe, they're healthy, they're treated with respect, and so from whatever, unless you're a total maniac, narcissist, sociopath, like certain people we could name, if you're if you're a regular person, despite the polarization, I have no, it doesn't serve me at all to ever get into a shouting match with anybody. It's like,
Yeah.
but if we can come together on mutual compassion, mutual empathy, if we can come together in the middle, and take action that leads somewhere, I think that's great, and that's the power of television. That's, TV can do that, because Star Trek, it didn't have a political litmus test. It's clear,
Yeah.
What those guys were about, but still, there are people on the right and people on the left who love Star Trek and X-Files and Breaking Bad and
And
Better Call
Twilight,
Saul. Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
And you're right. It brought people together. That's a wonderful thing. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yes. And again, I don't, it's funny because, with Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad, I don't think of those as, they're certainly dark shows and terrible things happen in them, but they're redemptive. And there's a message of love. You have to go to the mat for the people you love. You have to step outside. That if you don't love anyone, then your life is worthless. It has no meaning. You have to, and so that's redemptive. And I find that an important message, and so, you can, I mean, certainly Serling was writing characters who go very much into the dark side sometimes, but,
Yeah.
you know, there's a moral universe, and it's fascinating. And all of us have to decide as writers where we place our moral compass, but no subject is off limits. And by the way, Rob would love the fact that TV is so much more free now than it was in his era, that you can write about really major subjects, So yeah.
It's so amazing. I watch so many different shows. I won't even name any of them. Just any show that's out there, and I had this countless. It's like the lead actor will say, I sacrifice everything. I've done everything for this family. Everything I do is for this family. And I keep going back to Vince and Breaking Bad and Walt.
Yes.
It's like
Yes.
you want to believe in this person, and he or she thinks they're doing such a good thing, But meanwhile,
Yeah.
that's just their way of justifying what they're doing, this bad thing to, they're doing it for the family, you know?
Yeah. Well, one time
But
years ago, oh, I'm sorry, Vince. Go ahead, please.
no, no, go ahead, Mark. Yeah, it's all
I,
good. Yeah.
years ago, I met a retired gangster, and he told me Elaine and I drove 12,000 miles around the U.S. just interviewing people in small towns about their lives. Years ago, during one of the Writers Guild strikes that went on for 6 months, and so ultimately we said, well, yeah, let's see what this country's about, and I interviewed a retired gangster, and he said, when you ride the tiger, you go where the tiger goes, and so that's what happens with Walt, God knows,
Good
and
line.
yeah, 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 yeah. And it's sort of like, you go into the darkness, but then, who are you and what are you? It's Walt's family, separates from him, even though he loves them ostensibly, but he's lost himself. And then, but for Jesse, he comes back to that point of self-sacrifice because Jesse has also become a son in a way, even though
Yeah,
Jesse's a very flawed character, but there is
yeah,
that connection. And even when people say throughout the show, people are saying, why don't you get rid of Jesse? Because he's a fuck up and he's a drug addict and that's the smart position to take.
Well, it
And
was an
yet,
option at one time too, wasn't it, Vince?
yes, well, you were
yeah.
even
Well, actually, and early on it was
yeah,
until I
yeah,
got to know Aaron Paul, and I was like, no way, I'm killing this guy.
right.
But
But that's
no, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no,
Yeah.
no, please, you're no,
But you guys are very sweet, and I could not, about saying all those nice things about Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, I could not be more proud of those two shows. They're like
yeah,
children I never had. But I got to say it, Twilight Zone is more universal. I
mm,
could not be more proud. I'm not taking anything away from Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, but when you can make a show that 40 million people, 50 million people tuned
yeah,
into, how many it was, and it was a different time. There was only three or four
yes,
channels,
yes,
but when you can create a show that people are still watching 60 years later, I mean
amazing.
that's
Yeah,
what I hope for Breaking Bad. But it's never at best. I mean, we all hope for our work to live on long past the day we're no longer here,
yeah,
Twilight Zone, it is more. Not only is it 60 some years later and counting with no
hmm
end in sight as it
yeah,
should be, but it's more universal because it is positive. Breaking Bad is pretty negative, and it was never intended to be for everybody. It's a
yeah,
very specific character study of a certain finite number of characters,
yes,
and I'm very proud of it. But Rod Serling wrote about the
yeah,
human condition writ large, and he wrote,
yes,
and it was optimistic and it was positive. And I'm trying to do that with this new thing we're doing, which I can't give any details on, but I'm I'm trying to take a page, kind of sort of. I mean, not in any story way or whatnot, but in the
right,
optimism. Trying to
yes,
trying to be that
yeah.
guy now.
But that's why it's so great that TV is about these surrogate families or real families, and it's about human connection or failure to connect. It's about the people, and that's something I love about science fiction. In the show I'm doing now, it covers 200 years in a future history with four families, so we get to see the repercussions. We jump between generations, and it's very, very fun to see that and see that in some cases people make the right decisions, but it has negative fallout because the right decision wasn't 100% without collateral damage, and so then you start to see that, and then you have to clean up the mess you inadvertently made, and so forth. And but I love that, and TV. See, this is also, you were mentioning Aaron Paul, and I think this is where it's great to be the showrunner because the show talks to you. If you're, because it's bad, I think these shows where they write all the scripts and then fire the writing staff and then shoot the show, it's a huge mistake because the show talks to you. You'll see an Aaron Paul and you'll say, oh wait, we're not going to let that guy go, or
Right.
and this is where I've been very lucky because I came into TV. I started writing for television around 1977, 78, and I worked for all the major studios and networks, hundreds of hours of produced television. And and as you know, when you're on a show and you're seeing the dailies and you're seeing what works and what doesn't work and how to fix stuff, and you learn. I mean, so many of my friends are very wealthy screenwriters who've never seen a word of theirs filmed. They might be earning $1 million a script for a few years, and then they're out. They're no longer the hot thing. But to be a TV writer where you see week after week, month after month, year after year, it's a conversation between you and the show and the creative personnel on the show. And I love that. I think that's just wonderful.
I do
Indeed.
too. I love that. I wouldn't trade that for anything. It's like it's the closest thing to the old studio system before TV was invented, and
Yeah.
writers would be typing away, and they give the script over, they go off and make it, and then they'd be making another one, and making this movie, making that movie.
Yeah.
That's the only way to learn to do the job is if you get that feedback, not even from the audience, although
Right.
that's very important, but from your own eyes and ears. This worked, that didn't work. It's. I
You
feel
learn
very
from your
lucky to get to
mistakes,
do it.
for sure. For sure.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, well, and you don't learn. I maintain you don't learn from doing things right in life.
No,
You
No.
no,
only
No.
learn from the mistakes.
that's
Yeah.
right.
That's real.
That's right.
But I love the fact that as a writer, producer, director, there are many tricks that I can do that are really fun. Like for instance, I think in the previous episode, previous 2 hour episode, the one we're in post on, I think there's 2 scenes in that episode that we didn't actually shoot. What we did was we were able to contact our actors and say, "Can you give us this ADR line, and
Mhm.
we'll take something and we'll make magic." It's like that shell game that you were talking about with Ricky Jay, and it's
Real.
like and so you can like really, I mean, with green screen and so forth, there's a lot of things you can do where it's like, huh, we've got this green screen shot of this actor. Well, it was fascinating. One of the things we did was, because I wrote for Babylon 5, I cast several of the actors from Babylon 5 in this show. One of them was Mira Furlan, the great Mira Furlan, who was also in Lost. She was an amazing actress. And sadly, during the pandemic, she was at home during the pandemic and she got bit by a mosquito and got West Nile and died of West Nile, which is so tragic and ironic and crazy. But we had initially intended for her to be a viewpoint character through the entire series. Now, suddenly she's gone. And so we had to write a heroic exit for her character utilizing. I didn't want to do an AI thing or any of that stuff, but we found some lines that we'd cut, some footage, and we were able to repurpose that to give her a heroic exit. And that was really. I'm glad we were able to do that. But there again, you never know what the fates are going to hand you.
Agreed.
So fascinating.
Gentlemen, can you
Fascinating.
believe it? We've spent 90 minutes here in the Gilliverse /
Wow.
Twilight Zone.
Wow.
That's fantastic. I told
Wow.
you it was going to be 60 minutes and 90 minutes, and that flew by. Didn't it feel like 30 minutes to you?
That was fun. That
That's
was
absolutely
fun.
fantastic, Vince.
Yeah,
I know
well,
I know you can't. We were told, and we know for sure we can't ask anything about your new show. But once it airs, would you like to come back and talk some more about it? And once you can talk about it,
yeah.
Absolutely. It is. I think it's out there that it stars the wonderful Ray Seahorn.
Yes.
I don't think I'm giving anything away.
no,
with
that's
that.
common knowledge. Yep.
She's
And,
great.
and I can't wait for people to see it. She is so good in it. We are. I can't say anything about the specifics of what
Nope.
it's about, but I can say that we just yesterday, last night, 11 p.m. finished up sound mixing the first episode.
Wow.
And we're editing episode 8, I think, and I think it's going to be 9 episodes. I think I can say that much, but I could not be more proud of it and the work that she does in it. And we have some other actors I'm not supposed to name yet.
There you go.
But they're all tremendous.
I know what
And
we'll do. Ray's been very good to us in the past too. She's come on 2 or 3 times. I think she came on once before we even had this, as it's called, the Gilliverse, on my Rock Shop live show, and I think she came on another time with Tom. And then she was when I retired from this 3 years ago, Bob and Ray were the last 2 guests simultaneously. So that was kind of nice. And Bob, believe it or not, you've worked with him so much, but Bob can sometimes have verbal diarrhea, and he actually gave the ending out live on our show. Kind of. And people are like, oh, you know what I mean?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he did. But it's great. I got some great reviews out of it. He made me rich for a day or 2. But no, but I'll reach out to your people and Ray's people and have you both on at the same time when we can. But Mark, before we say goodbye to you, so a big thank you to our producers, Karina and Bob, for putting this on. And they've assembled some great links of all your stuff
Yes.
where they can find you. But I'd like you just to verbally tell us where people can find out more about you and so on.
The best way to check out what I'm doing is I have a YouTube channel called Mr. Sci-Fi, so that's SCI-FI. And my email is markzickery@gmail.com. Obviously, if anyone wants to invest in any of these crazy things I'm doing, they're welcome to. But or if you want to come to the set and watch us shoot, we're going to be shooting June, July, August, and onward into the fall. It's as I say, we're in active production on Space Command's 12 Hours, and also shooting my wife's feature with Barbara Bain and Armin Shimmerman and so forth, Doug Jones, and it's great fun. So and Vince, this has been a wonderful time. I've really enjoyed it, and hopefully we can get together. I'd love to take you to lunch or something and just get to know you better, because you're an amazing man.
Well, thank you so much, Mark, and I appreciate that, and best of luck with the amazing. You got you're like you're your own kingpin. You got your sound stages, and I'm very impressed. It sounds like you're doing amazing stuff.
Yeah,
well,
it's fun.
It's an absolute pleasure, and I'm very thankful for Bob coming to me with this idea. Bob approached me, it's got to be about 8 months ago now, maybe 10 months, as well, early into the year last year, and he talked about this show, and I said, okay, And I thought maybe we could, like I had retired from Gilliverse, retired from podcasting completely because I got a new profession I was doing, and I kind of miss this. So this is up to the fans watching this right now too. If you'd like to see more Gilliverse, you'd like to see me do it, at the end of this video, comment below and let me know, and I'll even throw you in, God rest his soul, Mark Margolis. We'll throw in a bobblehead. Yep. Hector Salamanca bobblehead. I'll send that out to one lucky viewer. So comment down below, like and subscribe, and I'll randomly choose and send it out to you. But yeah, if you'd like to see more of that, I'd like to do it. It was a lot of fun. It's been 3 years almost, and I get to join it with two creative minds like you guys, and it's an absolute pleasure. I just sit here, push the buttons, and let you, the talent, do the thing. So thank you very much for joining me.
You're very welcome.
This is a lot of fun, and thanks to Bob and Mark. I learned so much about one of my very favorite shows tonight, and thank you for writing that wonderful Twilight Zone companion all those years ago and keeping it updated. That's great.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Vince. And again, I think that you really are, the child of Rod Serling. I mean,
that's great.
I mean, Rod would have loved your shows. He would have loved what you're doing. I mean, it's just, you're carrying the torch, and he's the inspiration, and we're the children of Serling. So this year marks my 50th year as a professional writer. So
Congratulations.
I've been very, very blessed. So, but I've really enjoyed our conversation. I think you're a terrific guy, and this is, by the way, this is also proof that you don't have to be an asshole to succeed. That you can be a nice guy.
Some good ones, yes.
Yeah, you can be a good guy. You can have a human heart. You don't have to turn into a monster to make it in Hollywood. So there you go.
Well, I had my moments, but well, thank you.
We all have. Before I say goodbye to you gentlemen off the air, I have to read a little bit of thank yous as well too, just because I will forget, and I hate to leave people out. So a big thank you to Bob Rich, one of our producers, founder of the Vince Gilligan fan group on Facebook. Those links will be in the description as well too. So thank you to him for bringing the show idea to us. Also a huge thank you to our producer Karina and her moderator team of Eamon and Jen. Thank you very, very much for making the show run so well. And also thank you to our sponsors, Rode Microphones and Warren Royal and the team at bobbleheads.com. So that's fantastic, and I really hope this if people enjoy this, we'll get back into it again, and it was a real pleasure. I certainly couldn't ask for a better show than having you both to join it. And Mark, it's so nice to meet you. Bob's been talking a storm about you, like. Yeah.
Well, I'm a character.
Gentlemen, I will say goodbye to you off the air, so don't go away. And everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. And it's a long weekend for us here in Canada, so if you're a Canadian viewer, be safe out there and enjoy. And we'll talk to you, maybe see you here on Gilliverse again sometime in the near future, depending on what those comments say down below. If you don't want me to do it, tell me you don't want me to do it. If you want me to do it, tell me you want me to do it. See you soon, everyone. Until next time, cheers.
Thanks again for tuning into Inside the Gilliverse with Eric Broadbent. Be sure to check back each week for more great discussions and interviews with cast and crew from Breaking Bad, El Camino, and Better Call Saul. Please like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends.